In this section, we're going to learn how to create custom directives. Throughout most of this course, we've been creating custom components because they allow us to write reusable code. Along with components, we've been using directives to change how an element behaves. Directives can also be used to listen for events and binding attributes. Most of the directives that come from Vue are useful 95% of the time. The other 5% of the time, you may need to create a custom directive. Directives allow you to modify a small portion of an element without having to create a whole component. They're straightforward, but can be very powerful if used right. Custom directives can be registered globally or locally. We'll start by learning how to register them on a global level. Afterward, we'll look at local registration. Our first directive will be straightforward. We're going to create a directive that will render an icon. Sprinkled throughout the application are font awesome icons. It would be a good idea to create a directive that will inject an icon for us. The directive we'll create will be able to render an icon correctly for us. In the editor, create a folder inside the source directory called Directives. We're going to outsource the code into separate files. It's not required to register directives in separate files. This step is optional, but recommended for organization reasons. In the newly created folder, create a file called icon.js. Inside the file, we're going to export an object in the default namespace. The object we're exporting will be used for configuring the directive. Directives have lifecycle functions similar to components. There are 6 functions Vue will call whenever we use a directive in a template. They get called upon during different phases of the directive. The function that gets called will depend on what phase is currently occurring. Let's run through them. The first hook is called before mount. This hook will get called before the directive is mounted into the document. It's the very first hook that will get called in the entire life cycle of the directive. It'll only be called once. We can use it to do some preparation. The next hook is called mounted. This hook will run when the element has been added to the page. It's important to understand the difference between the before mount and mounted hooks. During the before mount hook, the element has not been added to the document even though the directive is loaded on the element. If you want to manipulate the element while it's on the page, you will want to use the mounted hook. Up next, we have the before update hook. Directives can experience updates similar to components. If a directive needs to be updated, this hook will be called before the update occurs. Afterward, we have the updated hook. It'll run when the element has been updated. For example, if you're using expressions or binding attributes on the element, and those get updated, you can expect this function to run. Next, there's the before unmount hook. Directives can be removed from the document. For example, let's say we were using a directive in a component that is being unmounted. The directive will also be unmounted. We can use this function to run some logic before the directive is unmounted. Lastly, we have the unmounted hook. This hook will run when the directive has been unmounted from the document. All 6 hooks are optional. You will most likely not use all of them unless you're creating a complex directive. Before we move on to using these functions, I want to go over the 4 arguments we'll encounter in any lifecycle functions. The first argument is called element, sometimes referred to as EL. This is the element in the document. The object will have the same properties and methods you would find on a JavaScript DOM object. You can change the stylings, inner content, etc. The next argument is called binding. This will hold the data that was added onto the directive. This argument includes the value and modifiers. You would use this object to give your directive more flexibility. We'll explore how to use this argument in a future lecture. Afterward, we have the vNode argument. This argument refers to the node in the virtual DOM. Vue will create a copy of the DOM called the virtual DOM. This argument is different from the element argument because the changes you make to it will not be reflected on the page. Both the binding and v-node arguments should be treated as read-only properties. Making modifications to these properties may not yield the desired results. There's one last argument that is only available to the before update and updated hooks. It's called previous node. This argument is the original node in the virtual DOM before the update occurred. You can use this to make comparisons to the updated node. Alright, we'll stop here for now. In the next one, we'll create our first directive. In this lecture, we're going to write our first directive. I've thrown a lot of concepts at you. Let's begin using the hooks and arguments we learned in the last lecture. We'll be working in the directive file we created earlier. In the configuration object for our directive, we'll add the before mount function. The two most commonly used lifecycle functions are the before mount and updated hooks. We're using the before mount hook because we want to insert the icon before the element is inserted into the document. The before mount hook will run before the element is inserted into the document. It's the perfect opportunity to add the icon. In the function, we're not expected to return anything. If we want to make changes to the element, we need to make them directly to the element parameter. In the function's parameters, we'll add the element parameter. The properties and methods are the same ones you would find if you were selecting the elements with vanilla JavaScript. Therefore, we can access the inner HTML property like so. The value for this will be the HTML for the icon. Open the home component file located inside the views directory. There's an icon in this component. The icon can be found in the main content section. It can be found under a comment that says icon. Cut the element and paste it in as the value for the inner HTML property. The string is entirely static. Ideally, we'll want to make the icon swappable with the icons listed in Font Awesome's directory. We'll learn how to handle that in a future lecture. If we leave it like this, this will completely replace the content inside the HTML. We don't want that. We want to add an icon inside the content. We can use the += assignment operator instead. This is the minimum setup for a directive. The next step is to register the directive. We're going to register the directive globally. In your editor, open the main.js file. Directives must be registered before the application is mounted. This file is where we're creating the view instance. At the top of the file, we'll import the icon file. We're assigning the import to a variable called icon. We'll need the configuration object to register the directive. Down below, along with other use functions, we'll call the directive function on the app instance. This function has two arguments. The first is the name of the directive. All directive names will have the v prepended to it. The v is how Vue identifies a directive. This way, they don't get mixed or treated the same as attributes. We're going to call our directive icon. The second argument is the configuration object. We'll pass in the icon object we imported. Our directive has been successfully registered. The next thing we'll do is use the directive. Because it's registered globally, we can use it in any component in our application. Let's use it in the component where we previously grabbed the HTML. Back in the home component file, we'll add the vIcon directive to the parent div tag where we previously cut the icon. The name of the directive is called icon. Despite that, we are required to prefix the attribute with v. This is very important to understand. You can't omit the v, otherwise this will not work. We won't assign a value to the directive. This is because our directive isn't expecting a value. This won't work just yet. Switch back to the icon file for a moment. If we were to look closely, a red line will appear below the element parameter in the function. It's telling us we can't directly mutate the element parameter because of ESLint. In situations like these, we'll need to tell ESLint to ignore this line. There is another solution, but it'll typically lead to another error. It's too much of a hassle to go with alternative routes. We can fix this by hovering over the squiggly line. The pop-up will have an option called Quick Fix. If we click it, we'll be presented with the option of telling ESLint to ignore this line. Select this option. Visual Studio Code will add a comment above the line. This comment will tell ESLint to ignore the next line. This is a trick I recommend you use sparingly. The purpose of using ESLint is to help you write clean and efficient code. It doesn't make much sense to ignore it every time. You will always want to follow its recommendations. The only time you should do this is when the alternatives are too complex. After making those changes, go to your browser and view the home page. The icon appears in the header of the card. You can even inspect the element to find that the directive has been removed, like most directives. Even though it's nowhere to be found, Vue is capable of updating the directive if changes are made to the element it's applied to. In the next lecture, we're going to modify the directive to take in data. We'll be able to make it more dynamic by accepting values. At its current state, the icon directive we created will output the same icon. In this lecture, we're going to adjust the directive to allow us to output any icon. We're going to continue working in the icon directive file. The part of the icon that should be dynamic will be the class. The value of the class attribute will determine what icon will get outputted. Every icon starts with FA. It doesn't matter which icon you're using, all of them will start with FA. Here's how we'll approach this problem. We'll create a variable for storing the class. In the function, we'll need to grab the value from the directive. We'll add the value from the directive to the class name. Lastly, we'll update the inner HTML property with the class variable. Let's get started. We're going to create a variable called icon class. The value for this will be the value we have in the class attribute of the icon. We're using a string literal because we'll be using interpolation to inject the value from the directive. We'll also update the inner HTML property to use string literals. The class attribute will have the icon class variable injected into it. After making those changes, replace this part of the class name with the following: binding.value. The binding object holds the value that gets passed into the directive. We can access the value through the value property. The binding argument currently does not exist in the function. We'll need to add it to the parameters of the function. We're finished. This directive will be able to output any icon. We'll need to update the home component because that's where we'll be using the icon directive. The icon we previously used was called Headphones Alt. Pass that in as the value. Make sure that you're passing this in as a string. Directives expect an expression. Once you've made those changes, switch to the browser. The icon will still look the same because we used the same icon, but it is more dynamic. We can use the directive to create almost any icon from Font Awesome. This is one way you can make directives dynamic. There are alternative methods of making the directive dynamic. We can use what Vue calls arguments. Arguments are the values you pass in after the colon in a directive. You're already familiar with that syntax because of the vbind directive. Let's use an argument to allow us to override the icon completely. In some cases, we may end up using a different icon set from another library. The icon set may use different class names than Font Awesome. We'll want a way to override the class names the directive generates entirely. Let's go back to the editor. In the home component file, add a colon after the vIcon directive. The value after this will be interpreted as the argument. We're going to update the directive to allow us to completely override the classes instead of modifying a portion of it. We're going to call the argument full. If the full argument is present in the directive, we'll allow the developer to override the class for the icon completely. In the icon file, after the icon class variable, add a conditional statement that checks if the binding.arg property is equal to full. The arg property will hold the argument value if one is passed in with the directive. We want the argument to be optional, so we're checking its value before we make changes to the class. If the argument is present, we'll reassign the icon class variable to the binding.value property completely. There is a limitation to this. We're limited to one argument at any given moment. You could check for different types of arguments, but only support one at a time. For our example, one is enough. Let's give things a test. If you refresh the page, you'll notice the icon is missing. This disappearance is because we're passing in a class that doesn't exist. Inspecting the document will show that the icon element is present in the document. The class we're using is invalid. If we want to generate an icon, we'll need to pass in the full class name to the directive. We're testing to see if we can override the full class with the directive, which we can. With one simple directive, we're able to generate an icon easily. Before ending the lecture, I will remove the full argument from the directive in the home component. We don't need to use it. In the next lecture, we're going to learn how to add modifiers to our directives, which are somewhat of an alternative to arguments. In this lecture, we're going to look at an alternative to arguments, which are modifiers. You're already familiar with modifiers. The vOn directive has modifiers for preventing the default behavior or stopping the propagation of an event. Unlike arguments, you can apply multiple modifiers to a single directive at the same time. Adding a modifier to your directive is similar to adding an argument. For this lecture, we're going to create two modifiers. One modifier will move the icon to the right side of an element. By default, that's already happening, but that shouldn't be the norm. We want the icon to hold a normal position unless a modifier is added. The second modifier will change the color of the icon to yellow. We'll apply both modifiers to showcase that you can have multiple modifiers added to a directive. Open the Home component in your editor. Search for the vIcon directive we added to this component. We're going to add two modifiers to the icon directive. We're going to call them right and yellow. Next, let's update the directive to support both modifiers. Open the icon file in your editor. We'll start with the right modifier. After the first conditional statement, we're going to create another one that checks if the binding.modifiers.right property is defined. Modifiers are stored in the binding object under a property called modifiers. If a modifier exists on a directive, it'll be added to the modifiers object. Its value will be the Boolean value true. We're not able to assign values to modifiers. They're either true or false. We can check the availability of a modifier by checking if it's true. View will automatically set the Boolean value for you. If it is, we'll modify the value of the icon class variable by adding the class that moves it to the right. In the string above, there's a class we're adding called floatRight. This class is a Tailwind utility class that will move the element to the right. Instead of adding it as a default class, we're going to cut this out. We'll append it to the icon class variable in the conditional statement. Be sure that you're adding a space before the class name. Otherwise, this will not work. We can begin working on the next modifier, which will change the color of the icon to yellow. Why don't you try creating this as an exercise? There's a class in Tailwind for changing the color of the text to yellow. Pick whichever color you like. The process is exactly the same, but with a different class name. Inside the function, check if the modifier is defined. If it is, append the class to the icon class variable. Pause the video. Good luck! Welcome back. If you were able to do this, then that's great. If not, that's fine as well. Let's walk through it together. Under the second conditional statement, create another one that checks if the binding.modifiers.yellow property is true. If it is, append the text yellow 400 class to the icon class variable. Just in case, we'll add an else block for changing the color to text green 400. In the static list of classes, we can safely remove any text color classes from the element. That's it. We've successfully added both modifiers. Switch back to the browser to view the final result. The icon will continue to appear on the right because we have the right modifier added to the directive. The color of the icon has changed to yellow. I want to test if the directive will still work if one of the modifiers is missing. Back in the component file, I'm going to remove the right modifier. Lastly, I'll refresh the page. The icon will not move to the right of its parent element. Let's check the console for errors. After confirming there are no errors, we can consider the directive complete. Modifiers are the better alternative to arguments because you can define multiple at once. The one disadvantage that modifiers have is that they can't be dynamic like arguments. The arg property will always be defined in the binding object, whereas modifiers will return undefined if they aren't available. Both can be useful depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Before I end this lecture, I'm going to add the right modifier back to the directive. I think the icon floating on the right looks more appealing this way. In this lecture, we're going to cover how to register directives locally. The difference between a local and global directive is where they can be used. Other than that, there isn't anything else that sets them apart. The hooks and their arguments are the same. We're going to create a copy of the icon directive, but we're going to change things up a bit. Sometimes you may want to pass in multiple values to a directive. Not just their name, but the value for them as well, allowing you to get around the limitations of modifiers and arguments. First, let's see what our directive is going to look like. Open the Home component file in your editor. We're going to replace the custom icon directive from the component in the template. The name of the new directive will be called v-icon-secondary. The v-icon-secondary directive will create an icon like the other icon directive. However, instead of passing in a string, we'll pass in an object. The object will have two properties called icon and right. We'll set the icon property to headphones alt. The right property will be set to true. Passing in an object is an alternative method to using arguments or modifiers. It's more flexible because you can pass in more complex values to the directive. We're going to exclude the color modifier and full argument to save some time. After this lecture is over, you are more than free to add those two features back to our directive. For now, these two properties will suffice. The directive currently doesn't exist. We'll need to create it next. In the Directives directory, create a file called iconsecondary.js. We have the option of defining the directive in the component file instead of an external file. We're going to write the code in a separate file to keep things organized. It doesn't hurt to do so. In the file, we're going to export a default object. Next, go over to the icon directive file. Copy the binding function over to the directive file we just created. The code is going to be similar. Because we're not going to support a color change or overriding the entire class, we're going to remove both conditional statements from the function. We're also going to add the text green 400 class back to the element. The binding.value property can be treated as an object instead of a string. Update the value of icon class variable to access the icon property. That's where we defined it. Then, update the conditional statement to check if the binding.value.write property is true. That's it. We've updated the directive to use object syntax instead of using modifiers and arguments. You may want to take the extra steps to verify the data types to prevent anything unexpected from happening. The very last step is to register the directive. Back in the home component file, scroll to the script block. We'll import the file with the name icon secondary. Directives can be registered locally by adding the directives property to the component. We'll add it below the components property. The value for this will be an object. In the object, the property name will be used as the directive name. The value of the property will be the configuration object for the directive. We're going to call the directive icon secondary. Its value will be the icon secondary object we imported. As I said before, we could have defined the directive inside the component, but I believe outsourcing the code to a different file will make this neater and organized. Let's view the directive in action in the browser. The icon will continue to be placed to the right. We have two directives that do the same thing but with different logic. One uses arguments and modifiers. The other uses object syntax in the value to provide it with information on how the icon should appear. Neither is wrong. It entirely depends on how you want to structure your directives.